Hello, how are you? Well, it's good afternoon, the next day after Thanksgiving. We probably all have cause to exercise a little bit to get rid of that loggy feeling for eating too much. And as much as I try to parse what I ate, I couldn't help it. And I'm a person, I look at a slice of bread, I gain a pound. So the weather, I'm wearing a cap in part because it's in the 40s and I want to feel comfortable. There's no wind to speak of, so it's pretty pleasant and the sun is out. As for the news, I'm probably focused a little differently than on the top story, which is the Middle East. I read a terrific report in the Washington Post today. And the question was, what are farmers going to do? And obviously, we're talking about global warming. That's right, global warming, not climate change. Climate change, whenever you say it, is to help those fossil fools who would destroy our planet with, their economic model, if you will. So, putting that aside, the question for farmers is, what's next? And the answer is difficult. Is it going to be more deep fried chickens, pecked almost to death before they're frozen, waste without a place to go? I don't know if you've seen the examples of the enormous waste from these large industrial farms that we have now. And we have chickens and cattle, all sorts of waste, expedited pregnancies, growth hormones, pollution in the land, pollution in our bodies. And what's the answer? And I don't think I can do that in a walk and talk. But some of it's obvious. It makes a difference if we're eating fewer animals, domesticated animals. I understand maybe everybody has a preference for it. But increasingly, I think, especially among baby boomers, there's a return to some of the habits of the school years, and that means more vegetables and so forth. And there are ways to approach that. The other things are, there's hydroponic farms, there are ways to preserve the land, ways to manage our resources better. But those questions don't seem to interest, anyone, because all of them take personal energy and funds and change. And change management is one of the most challenging things in any frame of reference that you could imagine. It's not just about the problems, the different problems we have. So put that on your agenda to think about between now and your New Year's resolutions. The other thing that you have to consider is the Middle East. Now, anything that brings hostages back to their families, and for the most part, if not exclusively, the way they're reported, these are non-combatants, down to very young people, children, and senior citizens. I refer to senior citizens as the saged. They're wise, and they're older, and our society does not respect them. Makes fun of them in every opportunity it can, including Biden for that matter, and that has a political implication that's pretty damaging to the body politic, damaging to the man on the street who's now approaching an older age. I was at a Starbucks the other day, and there was a fellow in front of me, and I couldn't tell the age, but he was moving slowly and taking his time to put things together in his wallet. And he was dressed nicely, and he seemed to be very consciously and deliberately doing what he had to do, but not as fast as he might have done 20 years earlier. And so when they were giving out, and I was right behind him, and when they were putting the coffees on the counter, he was looking, and he couldn't see well enough to know if it was his. The print is tiny when they do take your name. And so I pointed one out to him. Then somebody came in from outside in the parking lot and asked, sort of generally, did anybody lose their glasses? And I tapped him on the shoulder, and he turned around, and they happened to be his glasses. Now, I didn't have a conversation with him, but these physical aspects that we're all going to suffer if we live long enough, don't answer the other questions about us, which are how he thinks. If he and I were sitting down and speaking, you might find a man of great wisdom. I don't know. It's a mystery. Biden, we know who he is. We know what he's done. We know at what age he's done it, and still we make fun of him. Is he going to slip a word, forget a word? Is he going to have trouble reading prepared text? Is he going to have trouble speaking extemporaneously? How many people can speak in public? How many people can go to as many locations as the president does and speak at all? How many can actually consider action plans and then implement them? So I say this because Biden is in this situation in which if you're not with those suffering 100%, you're against them. So you choose one side or the other. If you're with one side or the other, or you try to be with both, then we can't talk to you. You failed us. Now, people are attacking Biden for not having a ceasefire. But if you remember, Biden originally sought a ceasefire. And Netanyahu very publicly declaimed any ceasefire. Our Secretary of State encouraged the possibility of pauses, which it seems to me is another less aggressive way to have a ceasefire. And so they started pushing pauses. And ceasefire came into the mix again. Well, you and I are not privy, if you will, to what's going on in trying to figure out some sort of settlement to an age-old debate, dispute, fight, almost warlike, almost all the time, between Arabs and Jews, Palestine and Israel. And Hamas seems to be characterized as a terrorist group by everybody, but the loss of life makes it hard to distinguish how you find a path from where we are to deal with this. So, do we have a good sign today that we have a pause and hostages? I think we do. You know, the old expression, the enemy of the possible is the perfect. Well, and politics is always described as how do we get to a result. And so politics is really, democratic politics is about compromise. Warriors, I mean pure warriors, violent, ignoring law, they proceed in a different path. So what you do for one is right now considered as against the other. So it is believed. Young voters are, according to a poll, of this mindset. It takes me back to when they killed our heroes in a single year, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And we went to a convention, and we couldn't find a clear path. And so Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president to Johnson, after the riot of police at the Democratic Convention, he had a heavy lift to try to run for president and replace his boss, Johnson, who was overseeing him and wanted there to be no embarrassment to whatever Johnson considered his legacy. And I had friends who either sat it out or thought they'd vote for Nixon. And I, as a young Paul, couldn't appreciate how that made any sense, but they did it. And Nixon became our president. And Humphrey was gaining momentum, but this is not horseshoes. You actually have to get the vote, and in the Electoral College, as people know. So is that what we're dealing with here? That people can't imagine how to compromise to move forward rather than to move not at all. and to continue the violence in a world that has a leaning in that direction. I've cited before how Alexander the Great wouldn't use his wit to figure out how to untie a knot, and so he took out a sword and hacked it. That's a good metaphor for what we're doing wrong these days. Violence, impatience, causing an imposition that might be avoided entirely or partly if we could find a way of peace, or a coerced method of going forward that doesn't involve the death of so many people who are honest and non-combatants. So that's our challenge today. I'm also, because I'm writing briefs and I'm dealing with pain patients and doctors, I continue to be amazed at how brutal government is when it comes to helping those who have pain function. How do we get over that? And I'm very suspicious of a nation that talks about fentanyl as if it were some sort of, kryptonite for humans who are not supermen, and when it is actually a legitimate drug that saves people pain when administered properly. And the fentanyl that we seem to be talking about, when we're honest, is illicit fentanyl, not the usual prescription of fentanyl, but that mixed unknowingly with bogus oxycodone that comes through Mexico, they tell us comes to us from China. All these stories, but they don't emphasize the fact that it is not fentanyl, lawful fentanyl, that is the scourge of Americans. And when you talk about a child having an overdose of fentanyl, that's not a prescription that they got. They probably didn't get a prescription for the oxycodone or whatever they thought they had if they didn't think they had fentanyl. And this propaganda is causing many people to be hurt and harmed. If you think of the machine, the meat-thinking machine that we walk around inside of, you know that if I had spent my life using my back to earn a living instead of mostly my mind, then I would probably have a different set of aches and pains as I get older. And I might have some severe ones that either compromise mobility or compromised a painless aging. That's what we're dealing with. And in communities where they're surprised there's so much pain medicine, they don't think of the fact that these are men and women who are working, longer than they, should have to, given the pain that's generated over a lifetime of hard and often physical work. I mean, if we really care about people who are older, we would care to make their life more pleasant. We'd be more attentive to it. We'd be more respectful of it, but we're not. And that combination with disinformation by our government is hurting people. And ironically, all through the codes, the statutes that we have, are talking about how they have these emergency powers to save the public from an emergency. And they use that in a fiat kind of way. They just announce, I'm closing you down, doctor. I'm closing you down, doctor. And they don't allow for the context in which the pain medication is given. So I'm writing about that for court, and I don't want to dive into the specifics out of respect for my clients, but this is the problem in America. Too little thought, too little nuance to a problem, And it's the phenomenon of legislation and rulemaking. Because if you write a rule for one thing, and particularly if you can posture yourself politically for re-election, or how you're saving the world even though you're not finding a cure for cancer, then what happens is it has unintended consequences. When I was on the Hill, particularly as special counsel to the Judiciary Committee, there would be arguments in the committee and proposals for legislation, and some would posture for the legislation, say, let the courts take care of it. That's not a responsible way to handle these things. I wrote a book years ago, and I don't think anything's changed since I wrote this criticism, Pain in America and How Our Government Makes It Worse. And it's worse now than it was. Imagine spending your life touting a belief that fentanyl is bad under all circumstances, and we have to stomp out any kind of pain medication anybody gets because we're making them addicts rather than dependent and rather than healthy so they can function. Okay, so that's my soapbox for today. I guess if I weren't writing these things, they wouldn't be popping out of me. So, beware of eating too much, because it seems to me that my temptations come on Thanksgiving, but then after that, the food is so good if you what you didn't consume on Thanksgiving. And Holly and I were the only ones serving our special Thanksgiving dinner, so we do have some extra food. In the meantime, I'm strolling on the Cathedral of Trees to make room for the next meal. All the best. Bye-bye.